Up until this point, we've looked at a lot of different logical operations that you can apply to premises and pull some new information out of it. And it's worth reminding ourselves that in deductive logic, that's what you do, right? To get a good argument, you have a conclusion that is a valid inference that you can pull out of those premises. If there's multiple conclusions and it's a well-supported argument, every conclusion in there is something that you can pull out of the premises through some valid logical step or a combination of valid logical steps. So that's what a good deductive argument looks like. It's a valid inference from the premises. But in today's lesson, we're going to take a look at some inferences that aren't good, that make mistakes, that take steps that aren't valid to try and pull out a conclusion, but ultimately it fails because they're not valid logical operations. The number of valid logical operations like contrapositive, modus tollens, modus ponens, the things we've looked at that you need on the LSAT is actually pretty small. So we've really learned most of that already. And that's good because anything else that isn't one of these valid forms that we teach you is going to be an invalid inference. And luckily on the LSAT, you're going to see these invalid inferences so much in flaw problems, in parallel flaw problems, and some other places that you'll get very used to spotting them as well and know right away that that's a mistake. So in this lesson, we just want to get you acquainted with the major mistakes that you see in deductive logic. These are all invalid moves that you can't do. I think this stuff is fairly tricky, so you really want to go over it extremely carefully in the text lesson, but we're going to take a quick look at the deductive errors here, these invalid inferences. The first and one of the more common mistakes people make is when doing contrapositives. Take a look at this sentence, pause the video, and then make a proper contrapositive. Here we've made a proper contrapositive where we've flipped the two terms, so what used to be the sufficient condition is now the necessary, and what used to be the necessary is now the sufficient, and we properly negated them. So we have a perfectly good contrapositive. This expresses the exact same thing as the first rule, just saying it differently. However, when people go to make these contrapositives, often they make mistakes, typically not switching the terms or negating just one when they switch it, or switching them both without negation, stuff like that. So let's look at some of those. These are probably the two most common errors that you see. In this first one, the two terms have been flipped, which you need to do, right? The necessary is now the sufficient and vice versa, but no negation occurred. So this is telling us that if Sullivan goes to the party, then Jones will go too. We don't know that. Sullivan going to the party is not a sufficient condition for Jones going to the party that we can pull out of this rule. So this is an improper reversal where we haven't done the necessary negation. In this next one, we've made another common mistake, which is that both terms have been negated, but they haven't been flipped. So it says if Jones does not go to the party, Sullivan will not go either. We don't know that. Jones not going to the party doesn't tell us anything about whether or not Sullivan will go. At first, often people haven't trained their intuition yet, and these look natural. From this initial rule, right, we know that there's some relationship between Jones and Sullivan, but it's limited in nature. Sullivan going to the party doesn't give us any information whatsoever about what Jones will do, right? And Jones not going to the party doesn't give us any information about what Sullivan will do. Both of these invalid inferences, these invalid contrapositives, make the mistake of thinking that you can know those things. To avoid these mistakes, it's very simple. Just make sure that every time you do a contrapositive, you both flip and negate. Just negating or just flipping is always wrong every time and will always yield an invalid inference. To avoid making these mistakes, you may always want to do diagramming, at least early on when you're first working with these rules. Let's take our original rule here, Jones party, then Sullivan party. The proper contrapositive is always going to have the same look with the negation and the flipping, right? Whereas if you were to do the improper versions here, the first one would be Sullivan party, then Jones party. You can clearly see that it's been flipped without negation, and then this other one has clearly just been negated without being flipped, this one right here. Now I want to look at some errors with modus ponens and modus tollens. These are actually closely related to the contrapositive errors we just looked at. Here we have our conditional statement, and then what looks like it might be a trigger. We're told that the necessary condition is going to happen, but knowing that the necessary condition occurs doesn't tell you anything about what happens to the sufficient condition. So there's no valid inference to be made here. A lot of people see this, diagram the rule, Jones party, then Sullivan party, then get what they think is a trigger, and then think that they can pull the idea JP out of this, the Jones parties as well. However, SP is simply not a trigger for this rule, and as a result, this is not a valid inference. Similarly here, people will try to diagram this one as if they're trying to do some sort of modus ponens-like inference, and then imagine that this is a trigger, right? And then seeing that Jones is not going to the party, they think, okay, well then maybe Sullivan isn't going to go either, and try and pull out this inference. However, again, the sufficient condition not occurring is never ever a trigger for a conditional rule, right? So the resulting inference here is fully invalid. From these two pieces of information, we would not know that we can pull this out. So we've just given you a look at some of the most common invalid inferences. There's a few more I want to cover, but just to make sure that we're being very careful and looking at them closely, I want to do it in the text lesson. There, we're also going to do a quick review of all the valid inference forms you've learned. So make sure you contrast these invalid inferences that don't follow proper deductive logical steps with the valid ones that you've already learned so far.